The story we're starting with tonight, because it brought down Hollywood heavyweights. It inspired worldwide protests, and most recently, it shook America's judicial system to its core. Now, 1 year after the first MeToo hashtag began trending on Twitter, we are seeing a revival of the movement in this very building. Last year, MEPs passed a resolution to combat sexual harassment in the EU, and advocates are still waiting for it to be implemented. And today, Parliament employees launched an anonymous blog meant to, quote, break the culture of silence. Take a listen.
In December 2017, I started my internship in the European Parliament. In the first days of my new appointment, I got into the elevator and inside was a man I did not know. He looked at me up and down and then proceeded to tell me that there weren't many beautiful women in the European Parliament and that since I was new, I should take the opportunity to taste his pancakes. He then told me that the pancakes should be eaten in the morning and that I should absolutely taste them in his place.
I received an email once at 2 in the morning from a political advisor working at the European Parliament, known for his passion for lustful photography. The email, sent from his work email to mine, included a series of pictures taken of me at work without my consent or knowledge. The subject of the email: I have more pictures of you.
I was a young male trainee at the European Parliament, fresh out of my postgrad studies and excited to get involved in politics for change. During a group off-site, I was too lenient with the open bar and ended up more under the influence than I usually allow. A friendly man followed me all night, and his bravado grew as the hours passed. Drunk and vaguely uncomfortable, I decided to go to my room and sleep. He followed me and begged me to be allowed to take the extra bed. Having no more fight left within me, I allowed him to take the extra bed in my large room, and I went to sleep in my own bed. The feeling of someone touching me woke me up. I continued to push his hands away from my body and repeatedly told him to stop. At one point he finally did, reluctantly.
I was sent on an official mission and decided to share my Airbnb with a colleague. One night I was in bed when I heard a knock on the door. My colleague walked in just his underpants. I got angry and insisted he leave. Instead, he barged and got into my bed. I was so scared that I curled up in a little ball and begged him to leave me alone. But rather than respect my wishes, he chose to assault me. I filed a complaint with the competent authority on the 3rd of October 2017. I am still waiting for their answer.
Well, these are very powerful stories. Jeanne, of course, I will start with you. Today, we have 5 stories on the blog. You told me there are 8 that you have currently. How pervasive is this problem in the European Parliament?
So I think those testimonies show 2 things, mainly. That sexual harassment is still happening today, even though the members of the European Parliament have adopted last October a strong resolution with the chapter dedicated to the European Parliament. It's still happening today. And what the other thing those testimonies show is that sexual harassment happened to men and to women at the same time. Even though the statistics show that 90% of the cases are the victims are women, it's also happened to men. And since this morning we receive, so the blog is public from this morning, and since this morning we received 8 new testimonies. On those testimonies, 4 are about men being victims. And we know, and I'm making a strong statement here, sexual harassment has no age. Sexual harassment has no frontiers neither. Sexual harassment is not making a joke or trying to seduce someone. Sexual harassment is illegal. And we, as a movement of workers, we wanted to create a safe space for workers. And this blog is about that, sharing your testimony. Because when you share your testimony, it's the first step of getting better. Or recovering, but not getting used to this kind of behavior.
Yeah, that also ended with one of the people who shared their stories with you still waiting for an answer to her complaint. So how would launching a blog like this or telling these stories, making it public, push the cause forward and get some action done?
We want to raise awareness on the culture of silence and impunity. And what we see, of course, the main focus will be about the testimonies because they are strong and powerful. But on our blog, there is also all the resources for people in order to get help. Because we know that the most essential thing is to no one to be alone in this experience. So in this blog, you will also have all the contact, internal contact or external contact of association dealing with sexual violences. Or also how to formally lodge a complaint, because we also know this is really hard, qualifying sexual harassment. Yeah. And defining in your daily life what is sexual harassment is a big challenge, getting the evidence as well.
Yeah, so Nina, what do you think is the biggest hindrance, I think, to getting some action on sexual harassment?
I think
implementation.
Yeah, absolutely clear that there have to be consequences for this kind of behavior. This is intrinsically about power structures, so it affects any age, any gender, multiple industries. So just as we see it in politics, we saw it in Hollywood, unsurprisingly, we even saw it in the world of international development aid. So it cannot be that known perpetrators, for example, there was a report that came out recently by the British government looking at the charity sector, where known sexual harassers were quietly moved on to another job because, it was too much of a scandal to be associated with this kind of thing. So there have to be clear consequences. And I think what is also very important for this debate is to distinguish what falls under the whole Me Too sexual harassment big frame, if you will, because an inappropriate comment, whilst obviously not appropriate, is not the same thing as violent assault. And I think there needs to be a terminology to deal with each of these offences appropriately.
Right.
And I think that's in some ways part of the problem with what has grown up over the last year or so. I think in many regards the Me Too movement is about what you've talked about and today in Parliament. It's clearly also part of this wider movement about power. And I think it's three things to a degree. It is about trying to correct the wrongs of history, or the wrongs of what happened in society today, particularly that power imbalance that still exists between men and women. Hence why men like myself feel, uncomfortable talking about it, but that is it. I think second of all, the Me Too movement to date has been about giving victims or survivors the chance to tell their story. And actually what has been interesting over the last year or so, and what this blog is trying to do, is to give people who have not had a voice in the past that voice. But third of all, this is about us as a society trying to have a conversation about what we think is right and wrong, what is appropriate and not appropriate, and that extends obviously to things that are illegal and definitely wrong, to things where it's a bit
grey area. Right.
And I think in that part, one of the problems of the Me Too movement globally, not talking just about the European Parliament here, is that to a large degree men have been shut out of that discussion. And I think that's been to the detriment, because ultimately not only are men sometimes the victims of inappropriate behaviour, but ultimately they have to be part of the solution, and they have to be part of the conversation. I think to date there's been an attempt by some to essentially shut men out, and I don't think that's helpful, because ultimately this is it's a big societal shift that has to happen, but it has to happen with everyone.
Absolutely. So men being part of the conversation, a point being made. And there are other opinions, obviously, in this debate, because support for the Me Too movement hasn't always been homogenous. One of the most well-known examples of this is a backlash to the movement. It was in an open letter to Le Monde earlier this year. It was penned by the actress Catherine Deneuve and a group of 100 prominent French women. It said, "What we are once again witnessing here is the Puritanism in the name of a so-called greater good, claiming to promote the liberation and protection of women, only to enslave them to a status of eternal victim and reduce them to defenseless praise of male chauvinist demons." All right, I'd like to put it, maybe Nina first. Do you see where she's coming from?
No, I think that's a ridiculous statement, because I think whether you're too idealistic on either side of the argument doesn't make sense, and you have to land somewhere in the middle. We know that sexual harassment is rampant all over the world. I mean, I come from a country where women are basically second-class citizens. And as I already pointed out, this has much more to do with the inherent structures of power. So even though there is a strong gender element to it, men and women are both, affected by sexual harassment. So I absolutely don't agree with this argument that by talking about sexual harassment, you're actually taking away women's agencies. Absolutely not. This is not only about women, it's about men and women, it's about structures of power in society, and men have to be a part of this conversation just as women
But you did make the distinction also on drawing the line between what's definitely illegal and assault and something that, it's inappropriate.
Exactly, and I think the problem is that around this debate, too often you get ideologues on either side. So you have some people saying, whatever is sexual harassment is all the same, and they tar it with the same brush. So you have to be able to determine what the nuances in that argument are. And on the other side, to claim that this is all nonsense and you're taking away women's agency by talking about this and this is a chauvinist experiment is also nonsense in my view.
And Jeanne, I was reading some analysis on what the debate within feminist groups, so feminism, some who would say, well, if you're being assaulted, then call the guy out for it. Don't be quiet. So how would you respond to that vision of, well, this is what feminism is about? Call him out. Be strong. Don't hide behind.
Yeah, but those victims are strong, like, because they are strong enough to speak out and to share their own stories. Of course, there is a problem of the official lodge of a complaint, but that is something else. But I will not say, just to go back to what you previously said, like putting the responsibility on the shoulders of the victims is a quite easy solution. To say to women who are victims or men victims of sexual harassment or sexual assault, you should speak out, you should complain, you should go to the police. I mean, everyone can say that, but in reality, doing it, making the step of doing it is quite much more difficult. And I do think, like, because I was really fed up hearing, like, oh, it's about culture. Sexual harassment is about culture. For example, Catherine Deneuve is a French citizen. I'm also a French citizen. So I've heard so many persons telling me, but French people like seducing other people. So maybe they are thinking seduction is exactly the same as sexual harassment, harassing someone. The fight against sexual harassment is not about saying to every man you will not be able to seduce anymore, or
no,
to
but I think there is a wider conversation to be had. Clearly, there are things that are legal and illegal.
Yeah.
And the things that are illegal need to be treated with the law. And if you've been a victim of that, you have to speak up, and the authorities have to deal with it. That's what happens in our society. Now, there is currently a wider debate at the moment about what we view as society to be appropriate and inappropriate. Now, that's not covered by the law. And yes, there should be potentially mechanisms up to judge what wider groups, like, say, the European Parliament, view as appropriate and inappropriate in a workplace. But we also have to understand that is a discussion. There is no what's appropriate to you, Tessa, or to me. It's different, and that is why this conversation is so difficult. But it has to be, as I say, a conversation we all have. And this idea that because potentially someone views what has happened to them as inappropriate doesn't necessarily mean it is inappropriate. And that's the really difficult thing. And I think we have seen examples recently where, because this is not as innocent until proven guilty, we have seen people who've been accused of things that certain people have viewed as inappropriate. They've been damned for it, but we've not had that discussion about, at a wider societal level, about what they've actually done is inappropriate, and yet their lives also then lie in tatters. It's really difficult.
It's a good, but
just to go back to what
I'll give you 10 seconds because we don't have much time. Go ahead.
But just to go back to what you said, like, this is also the reason why we did not give any names on that blog, neither of the victims, neither of the perpetrators, because we want to focus on the system and the structure of power.
And what's being done about it. Okay, good discussion that we're having, important discussion, a sensitive one, albeit, but we must be having.